Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get the program started. I'm Corey Hicks. I'm your Ag and Natural Resource Prairie View Extension Agent for both Houston and Walker counties. Thank you for joining us today and for the hay production program. I don't want to stand in between you and all this good information. We're going to try to fit it all within an hour. And so if you all would, please ask your questions in the chat box or hold them until the end of the presentation. But we'll go ahead and get started with Dr. Vanessa Corriher-Olson. She's the professor and extension forage specialist there at Texas A&M Overton Research Center. So take it over, Vanessa.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Hopefully my audio is good. Corey or Ashley will let me know otherwise. Thank you guys for having me join you this afternoon. So I was asked to talk about hay production and kind of forage management in regards to hay production. And so some of these best management practices I'm going to cover today, we could also apply to our pasture systems or our grazing scenarios as well. So our management tips, we're going to talk about harvest timing. That has it's a huge factor in regards to the value or the quality, the nutritive value of the forage we're able to produce. And that's very important in regards to meeting the needs of our own livestock, as well as potentially marketing our hay to other livestock consumers or producers in our area. Drought weather obviously is a huge factor on our production. This year, a good majority of the state is in drought conditions, and we'll visit that and have some discussion in regards to some management practices as a result of drought conditions. Soil fertility, anytime we're talking about forage management, soil fertility is at the top of our best management practices. And this year, is an added challenge with high fertilizer costs and expenses. And we just need to understand the importance of those nutrients and how that can influence our forage production. So how much hay we're able to produce, as well as the persistence of our forages. And then, of course, weed and insect control, we'll cover those briefly. Those are a critical component as well in regards to managing our forage systems, hay, pasture, and those can have a huge impact on the value or the value of the hay, as well as the yield that we can produce. So we're going to start with harvest timing. So the maturity of our forage, or the stage at which we harvest our forage, is going to greatly influence the nutritive value of our forage. And so most of us in East Texas, our hay production is off of Bermuda grass. This will see very similar results, even if we're harvesting Bahia grass as a hay. Bahia grass is a viable hay option or for harvesting for hay. The biggest challenge with Bahia grass is that it matures very quickly, or it produces a seed head, as well as it has a tough stem. I've heard a lot of producers say it really wears on their equipment, their cutters, very quickly, or much more so than, say, Bermuda grass does. So this is some research from the University of Georgia. So coastal Bermuda grass was born out of the grass breeding program of Dr. Glenn Burton at the University of Georgia. So was Tifton 85. Several of our hybrid varieties of Bermuda grass came out of that grass breeding program, or perennial grass breeding program, there at the University of Georgia in Tifton, Georgia. So this is an evaluation of how our harvesting time, or interval between harvest or cuts, can impact, of course, our yield as well as our nutritive value. So on the far left column, we have our interval between cuttings. So I typically recommend harvesting Bermuda grass every 3 to 4 weeks, really depending on and desired value or nutritive value, as well as, also kind of depending on weather that can influence our harvesting time. And we'll see how that can influence the value of our forage here shortly. So we do have to be flexible. Very often it may be hard to stick to a strict schedule, whether it's drought or weather has delayed yield or forage production, or has delayed growth, or if we have equipment issues, what have you. But ideally, my recommendation is every 3 to 4 weeks. And most people harvest based on quantity. Obviously, the longer we allow that forage to accumulate, or the longer we allow it to grow as we go from 3 to 12 weeks intervals between cuttings. Obviously, our second column yield in tons per acre goes from almost 8 tons per acre to over 10 tons per acre. So a lot of people tend to focus on yield. And when I talk to a lot of hay producers, they're very quick to tell me how many bales per acre they harvest or what have you. And yield is important. But when it comes to feeding livestock, nutritive value is much more important. We can produce a lot of poor quality hay that's ultimately going to be wasted by those animals, and then also increase their intake, how much they need to consume to actually get the nutrients that they need for their level of production. So the third column, going from left to right, is percent IVDMD. So that is in vitro dry matter digestibility. That is one of the best measures of energy or digestibility compared to TDN. Now, what most of us see on a forage analysis is TDN. That is our measure of energy. TDN at most labs is typically calculated. IVDMD is actually measured. So it's a more true measure of digestibility or energy. So if we remember, for energy, the higher the number, the more nutrients that animal is going to actually convert into a product, whether it's weight gain or milk for their calf or what have you, or just maintaining body condition. So if that hay at 3 weeks is 65% digestible, that means that only 35% of that hay is actually wasted. It's going to go back into that location through their feces and urine. So they're keeping and using 65% of those nutrients. And then, of course, crude protein. Most of us, when we talk about nutritive value of hay, we talk more about protein. A mature dry cow only needs about 9% crude protein. Our more active, more productive animals have a higher crude protein requirement. Obviously, younger, actively growing animals, lactating animals are going to have a higher crude protein requirement. But as you can see, we can get really high protein off of Bermuda grass if we harvest it at the appropriate stage. So our immature forages are always going to be higher in protein and much more digestible. As that grass matures throughout the season, it starts to develop and create and become more fibrous, having more fiber that's less digestible. So, of course, ruminants have the unique capability of digesting a lot more fiber than we do as monogastrics or kind of single-stomached animals. We can't, as humans, we don't digest a lot of fiber, but ruminants, cattle, goats, sheep, have the ability to digest a lot of fiber. However, there are fibrous components that are not digestible. And as that plant matures, that cell wall thickens and becomes less digestible. So that is why we see a decrease in digestibility. We're also going to see a drop in crude protein content. So to optimize nutritive value with Bermuda grass, we recommend every 3 to 4 weeks for harvesting to maximize or to optimize nutritive value as well as to optimize yield. So the harvest time is pivotal, is really the only factor that influences digestibility or energy value. Now, we can influence our crude protein content with our nitrogen input, and we'll see that later as we talk about fertilization. So, I was talking about how weather, different things can influence, especially rainfall can influence our harvesting time. So a lot of people always, kind of question or kind of weigh back and forth or try to figure out what would be better. Would it be better to harvest to avoid rainfall or to wait until after it has rained before harvesting, to try to get it harvested, say at 4 weeks, and then run the risk of having getting that hay rained on following harvesting before it could be baled, or delaying harvest. So this is a great illustration. So this is comparing harvesting time, maturity, as well as rainfall, and how that influences animal performance. So obviously, nutritive value of the hay is going to influence animal performance. So on the y-axis, it's average daily gain in pounds per day. On the x-axis are 3 bars. The first one is hay that was harvested at 4-week intervals. So, almost 1.5 pounds gain, and then delayed because of whether it's rainfall or other issues and not harvesting that hay until 8 weeks, you drop below 1 pound of gain per day. Now, if we had harvested at 4 weeks and then had rain on that hay, we actually have greater loss of nutritive value as opposed to letting that forage kind of stand in the field and grow a few more days or a few more weeks because of maybe weather conditions that are delaying us from accessing our property. So a greater impact on nutritive value if that hay, while it sits in the field, is actually rained on. If it is still, if it has, somewhat dried or cured to some degree, we can have greater loss of those nutrients. We'll have leaching of those soluble or digestible carbohydrates. So you'll see a drop or a decrease in digestibility of those forage of that hay once it's been rained on, if it hasn't been baled and then stored appropriately. Our timing of season can also influence the nutritive value of our forage. So this is often very interesting for a lot of folks as far as thinking about which of their hay harvest is likely going to be the highest in nutritive value. Of course, testing our hay can be important so that we understand how our practices influence that value, as well as it's a good tool for marketing our hay. If we can actually show to our consumers, this is why my hay is more expensive than someone else, because it has high digestibility and protein. So this was actually some research at Overton. Some samples that were harvested, they were actually taken from a pasture, so not true hay harvesting situation, but it's a good illustration of how our temperatures throughout our warm season, throughout our summer, can influence the nutritive value or digestibility of our forage. So on the y-axis, we have digestible dry matter. So remember, the higher the number, the more of those nutrients are utilized by livestock versus being wasted. And then on the x-axis, we have our harvesting dates. So starting in April and then ending in November, November 15th, which is, our average first frost historically. So you can look at the different lines if you want to, but versus coastal Bermuda grass versus common or Bahia grass, but they all have a very similar, almost identical trend. Obviously, highest digestible or dry matter or energy at the beginning of the season when that forage is very young, lush, green growth. We don't typically have very high temperatures at that time of the season. As we get into June, July, and August, when we start, getting over 90 degrees, potentially triple digits, definitely warmer nights, we're going to see a drop in digestibility during that high heat of that summertime period. And then we actually, once we get into the fall, October on to November, we actually see an increase in digestibility. That's based on, or that's because of cooler temperatures. Different weather patterns will influence that nutritive value. Now, it does not have this massive climatic drop off like you see on this particular graph. They just stopped sampling at that point. So that's a poor representation that's not a true representation of what might happen to the nutritive value after a frost event. But this is just to illustrate how temperature throughout our season can influence the nutritive value of our forage. So that is why most often our first hay cutting is most likely our highest in nutritive value. And then a lot of times, our fall cutting, our fall harvest is of greater value than any that we might harvest in the middle of the summer. Obviously, this can vary from year to year based on our temperatures. Last year we had a much cooler summer. We also had a lot of moisture. So that made harvesting tricky to begin with because of all the rainfall, and a lot of us weren't able to access our property in a timely manner because of moisture or flooding potentially. But this can vary. But this is, a great illustration to remind us, to help us think about the potential for nutritive value based on our weather throughout that season. So keep in mind that each of your hay harvest, even if you're still harvesting at 3-week intervals or 4-week intervals, may vary because of weather conditions, because of temperatures, just as much as it can vary based on harvesting time or harvesting intervals. So drought, weather conditions obviously will greatly impact our forage production, whether it's hay or pasture. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is what the front page or the home page of that website looks like. I always locate this website by just Googling U.S. Drought Monitor. This shows you the current conditions for the entire United States. If you click on the state of Texas, it will eventually can continue until you get down to the single state map. They update these weekly. So this was updated on May 31st. It was released on Thursday, June 2nd. So this Thursday, there'll be a new updated map. So as you can see, majority of the state is in either abnormally dry all the way to exceptional drought conditions. Now, for many of us in East Texas, we're fairly lucky. We're currently not in drought conditions or not even abnormally dry. Now, we have been previously this spring and this winter. Majority of the state was in drought conditions, and that included many of our counties here in East Texas. So we've had some reprieve with some moisture recently, and I can hope that we continue to receive some moisture, but it's been hit or miss as to who gets any of that moisture. And how much. I know a lot of people, are only getting tenths at a time or what have you. So obviously drought is going to influence our forage production, even with fertility, even with harvesting at appropriate intervals. Lack of rainfall can be a limiting factor as far as the amount of forage we're able to produce. So moisture is still a critical component for forage production, whether it's hay or pasture. So what I like about the U.S. Drought Monitor, because most of us know what current conditions are. We know if we've had rain, if we're, we listen to the weather as to when the next chance of rain might be. Most of us probably have rain gauges on our property or what have you. But what I also like about the U.S. Drought Monitor, if we go back to the homepage under conditions and outlooks, under that particular tab, you can find forecast or outlooks. And I like to look at the 90-day outlook. So this is the 90-day outlook. It was released in May. This is the outlook, what they're anticipating or predicting the conditions to be from June all the way through August. So still a majority of the state of Texas is brown colored, which means drought persists. And you can see a good majority of the western part of the United States is also in drought conditions. So that influences a lot of our agricultural production. But what I do not like is this yellow portion of East Texas, because that represents drought development likely. So now at one point, a month or so ago, a majority of the state was in that brown color, even including parts of East Texas. So we have had some reprieve in East and North Texas, but they are predicting, at least currently through the end of August, for us to have some drought development. So not a lot of good chances for rainfall. So this is important as we are thinking about our forage management, keeping in mind that lack of moisture, lack of rainfall can influence our overall forage management. It's going to influence our forage production. So we may not necessarily be able to harvest or collect as many cuttings as desired this year because of lack of moisture. We also have to be more mindful of the timing of our fertilizer applications to try to capitalize on any moisture we might receive, try to time those appropriately. And then, of course, drought stress can influence our weed control, how successful our herbicide applications could be. So it's just unfortunately an additional challenge, and it's a huge rainfall or lack of has a huge impact on our forage production. And we'll have to adjust other components of our best management practices as a result of drought conditions. So next is fertility. So anytime we talk about forage production, we cannot avoid talking about fertility at some point or to some degree. Of course, whenever it comes to making fertilizer decisions, soil testing is really the only place to start. A routine soil analysis is going to cost you $12 at College Station or at SFA. And it's the cheapest thing that you can do as far as making fertilizer decisions. And deciding how much or what to apply should not be made without a soil analysis, especially in a hay meadow. We are harvesting those nutrients. We are removing them from that location. We're selling them to someone else. We're feeding them to our livestock somewhere else, or we're storing them in a barn. So we're removing a majority of those nutrients. Now, in a pasture system, we're recycling nutrients. So one of my fertilizer considerations this year, because of high prices, has been to suggest for a lot of folks, if you can graze your hay meadows as opposed to harvesting, that is a way to reduce some of that nutrient demand for that particular piece of your property. Now, of course, to graze it has to have fencing, a source of water. There can be some challenges. A lot of our hay meadows are not fenced. They may not be connected to, part of adjoining property or contingent with other pieces of property. So it really depends, but that could be a viable option for some of us to help reduce some of that part of that fertilizer bill. But soil testing is going to be critical to making any fertilizer decision. In hay production, I recommend collecting samples every year because you are making such big changes, drastic changes to that soil environment as far as nutrient availability from harvesting. So we're going to talk about our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We're going to talk about why they're important, and then some different aspects of utilizing or increasing our efficiency with those nutrients. So just as a reminder, to produce a ton of coastal Bermuda grass, we need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. I personally like to remember those numbers. So whenever making recommendations or suggestions, that's a good starting point as far as what is actually needed to produce a ton. And then obviously, if you're anticipating, 8 tons per acre because you're harvesting every 3 weeks, then you can multiply those numbers by 8. And you can see how many pounds of actual NP and K are needed for Bermuda grass production to produce the amount of forage you're desiring or you're anticipating. So this is some research from Overton in East Texas. This is just to illustrate how Bermuda grass responds to nitrogen. It is a linear relationship. So the different colored bars are different rates of nitrogen. So we have 0, the dark blue kind of navy is 0, the orange is 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre, the gray is 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre, the yellow is 90, and then the paler blue is 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So this is just to show you the linear response. The more nitrogen we pour into that Bermuda grass, we're going to increase our yield. So obviously rainfall can be a limiting factor, but nitrogen can be a limiting factor to our forage production, to the amount of forage we're able to produce. But hay grass is very different. It will only respond to up to so much nitrogen. So the hay grass is very appealing for many folks because it does not require as much nitrogen. It will persist and produce on lower rates of nitrogen compared to Bermuda grass or many of our other forage species. So, but Bermuda grass has a linear relationship. So the more nitrogen we pour into that hay meadow, the more forage we are going to produce. Phosphorus, our second primary nutrient. We don't need as much phosphorus to produce a ton of Bermuda grass, only 14 pounds to produce a ton. Phosphorus is important for early growth and root formation. So it is critical if we are establishing or planting a new field, no matter what that might be, whether it's Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, or any of our cool season forages or legumes. We do want to pay attention to any phosphorus recommendations. Even so, on an established stand, you're not likely going to need a lot of additional phosphorus. So this could be a place where we could save some dollars, but we really don't know without that soil analysis whether that is an option. Some of our alternatives, such as broiler litter, tend to be very high in phosphorus. They often have, almost as much phosphorus as there is nitrogen available in that alternative. So do have to be mindful of that when we're looking at alternatives. We don't necessarily want to pay for nutrients we don't need. We want to be more efficient with our dollars as well as our fertilizer. Phosphorus is not very mobile. It's not subject to really moving in our environment like nitrogen is. I failed to mention that earlier. Nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient, so we do have to try to time our applications. And we do recommend splitting our nitrogen applications so that we do not run the risk of losing that nitrogen into the environment through volatilization or leaching. So we want to be mindful. So you will see on a soil test recommendation that you split your nitrogen applications. Obviously, it's very common that we're applying nitrogen between or following a hay harvest to support additional forage production prior to our second hay cutting because we are removing majority of those nutrients. Potassium, our third primary nutrient. This is one that I've been probably the most concerned about as far as we are making fertilizer decisions this year, because potassium is over $900 a ton. And a lot of people, we understand why nitrogen is important. It impacts yield. And so we tend to think about focusing more of our dollars on nitrogen and avoiding or saving money by not applying other nutrients such as potassium. But I like to say potassium is for persistence, and this is critical for Bermuda grass in East Texas. Our sandy soils are naturally infertile, and they don't hold on to things like potassium or nutrients like potassium very well. And so our Bermuda grass requires, for a ton, you need 42 pounds of potassium in order for that Bermuda grass to not only be productive, but to persist. So this is an illustration from a project in Overton on coastal Bermuda grass. The left plot had N, P, and K applied. The right plot on the right side of the screen had nitrogen and phosphorus applied, but no potassium. So that's a 0 kind of hidden behind that weed seed head. But you can see a huge difference in those plots. Obviously, you see some weeds, but if you look through those weeds, you also notice that Bermuda grass is starting to thin, and it's going to be less productive. So when you're looking at saving dollars or making, economical decisions on fertilizer, look at your soil analysis. What is recommended? Instead of just applying nitrogen, maybe reduce the total amount of fertilizer that you're applying and understand how that will influence your yield. So it may, reduce the number of bales you produce, or it may reduce the number of cuttings you get this season. But persistence, applying potassium is going to be critical for the persistence of those stands. Not only for this season, but also for, going into the following year or the following season. So balanced nutrition is critical. This is a great illustration. We're just leaving out a nutrient. Even applying nitrogen and phosphorus, you have a huge impact on yield. Even though you're applying nitrogen, you still have a reduction in yield because of lack of potassium. So those nutrients do interact with each other and are collectively important for optimum forage production and persistence. So if you do need to make a reduction, you're going to need to, you need all three nutrients. I would recommend reducing the total that is applied. But no, that will influence your forage production, and we may have to respond by reducing the number of cuttings that we harvest or reducing our stocking rate so that we're not abusing those forages so that they will continue to persist past this season as well as through this season, especially with drought conditions. Me and Corey were talking before we started the program about the importance of soil pH, especially for a lot of our forage species and specifically for legumes. But soil pH can also influence the ability of our grasses to actually utilize those nutrients that we've applied. So pH will influence the ability of those grasses to harvest or recover those nutrients from the soil environment. So the blue line indicates what the lab considers to be the critical level, which is 5.8. This is a broad generalization across all forage species. Know that some forage species, like legumes, are going to require soil pH of at least 6. Some of our grasses will tolerate a lower soil pH. Bahia grass tends to tolerate acidic soils, much more so than Bermuda grass does. But, still Bahia grass with a soil pH below 5.5, you're going to start to see a decline in production as well as persistence. I've seen, most people think that, Bahia grass would grow with nothing, but I've seen Bermuda grass fields that slowly became primarily Bahia grass because of lack of nutrients and lack of lime. So that soil pH got to a point where the Bermuda grass can no longer persist. And then with time and continued neglect, that field is now primarily broom sedge bluestem. That Bahia grass, because the soil pH is entirely too low, even for Bahia grass, it's not able to persist. So pH can influence the persistence of those forages, of those species. And keep in mind, different species and different varieties have different requirements or different needs based or for the tolerance of soil pH. So if you ever have questions, what's the recommended or desired pH for your given forage species or variety, please reach out to Corey, to myself. We're happy to help to make any recommendations. Lime can get expensive and hard to come by, and depending on your forage species, variety, as well as what your soil pH is, that might be where we could save some dollars, or we may need to invest some dollars there and maybe reduce our total fertilization to optimize the utilization of those nutrients for that forages that we're growing. I mentioned alternative nutrient sources earlier. That's become very popular this year. Got a lot of questions, people asking, fertilizer's too expensive. What are my options? What else can I do to maintain my forage and to be productive? So animal manures are very common in East Texas, especially poultry litter. Just keep in mind, this table illustrates the variability of those sources of nutrients as far as how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are available. So we just look at broiler litter, the numbers in parentheses are the ranges. So it can range anywhere from, 34 pounds of nitrogen per ton all the way up to almost 90 pounds of nitrogen per ton. But on average, somewhere from 50 to 60 pounds is the average. And you're going to see very closely the same amount of phosphorus, which we don't need a lot of phosphorus for Bermuda grass production. So we want to look at the true value of this product as a source of nutrients. And we want to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck, so to speak. So I've had producers tell me that for them, based on what they need, what they're trying to achieve, poultry litter did not price out very well for them, did not price out any cheaper compared to commercial fertilizer, to urea or ammonium nitrate potentially. So do keep that in mind. Look at the potential value, the cost of that product, depending on your location. That will also vary that will also create variability in the potential cost. I know most poultry litter sources have told me they kind of have a 90-mile radius. They don't deliver or don't move much past that, beyond that, because of cost. And now that diesel and fuel costs have also gone up and are fairly high, that can also influence the cost of some of these alternatives for us as the user. Other alternatives, I was talking to someone today about a lot of these non-traditional products, or what I often refer to as snake oils, that tend to come out on the market when fertilizer prices are high. Dr. John Jennings at the University of Arkansas has been able to do some research on Bermuda grass, looking at these non-traditional products compared to more traditional or commercial fertilizer sources. And in this table, they are ranked from highest yielding to lowest yielding. The untreated check means that nothing was applied. And if we use those non-traditional products solely or only by themselves, we do not see that much more forage produced compared to doing absolutely nothing. A lot of these products do not actually apply any nutrients. Some of them, the C90 mineral, there's no nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium in that. There may be a little bit in the fish emulsion. It just depends on that process. Monty's plant food does have NP and K, but their percentages or their volume is so low that to actually apply to a level to reach the desired yield, it's not going to be very economical. It's going to oftentimes end up being more expensive than traditional fertilizer, or just not a cost savings whatsoever. So if you come across a product you're not familiar with, you want to know if it is a viable option, reach out to Corey, myself, someone in Extension with Prairie View or Texas A&M. We are happy to help you to kind of determine what you're actually getting, what is the recommendation versus what would be needed to what would need to be applied to reach your desired level of production. So last, weed and insect control. Of course, this time of year, I get a lot of questions about weed identification, herbicide recommendations. Right before I logged on, I got a text message with a picture wanting a weed identified and a recommendation given. So it's very popular during this time of year. So most of us are actively trying to control our weed populations. Of course, if we follow a lot of the best management practices that we've already talked about, such as maintaining soil fertility, soil pH, being mindful of not overgrazing our pastures or not abusing our forage systems, that can help to reduce some of that weed competition. When we do not fertilize Bermuda grass, it becomes less competitive against undesired species. If it thins because of lack of potassium, that creates an opportunity for undesired species to start to fill in those spaces. They have access to sunlight, and those seeds can start germinating and become problematic. Following best management practices is the top method of weed control. Now, granted, even if we are following best management practices, we have good growing conditions, we can still have some weeds, undesirable species pop up here and there, maybe because of, too much rainfall or birds flying over depositing seeds, what have you. So other means of weed control, mowing, mechanical method. It's very popular. Most of us use mowing or shredding because of instant gratification. The weeds in front of us, we mow over it. It's no longer a problem. It's not there. It's visually gone. But unfortunately, that's not very effective. The rare time that I recommend mowing is during the establishment year. So if we have planted Bahia grass or Bermuda grass from seed or sprigs, many times mowing may be our only option to try to reduce the competition from that weed pressure. Now, we're not mowing those sprigs or those new seedlings. We're setting our mower height so we can just kind of clip those weeds and open up that canopy so those new sprigs and seedlings have access to sunlight and can hopefully kind of outcompete or try to fight against those weeds. The thing we have to keep in mind with mowing is that when we mow our weeds, we're also mowing our grass. I should have included it. I can find it if anybody has interest. Dr. Paul Bauman, who used to be our weed specialist at College Station, he's retired, in coordination with Dr. David Beatty, who was a previous forage specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, did some research comparing, looking at fertilization and weed control, timing of herbicide application, and how that influenced forage yield, forage production. So they also looked at mowing as a means of weed control. And even when fertilizer was applied, if mowing was used as a means of weed control, that still negatively impacted our forage production. Even though you were fertilizing to promote forage production, as you were mowing those weeds, you were clipping that forage as well. So that can reduce our overall forage production. So with the scenario we are in, if you are fertilizing, I do not recommend mowing as a means of weed control unless it is a new stand, a newly sprigged, newly seeded stand. Of course, the use of herbicides. We're all actively using herbicides. As always, remember the label is the law. During the summer, make sure you are paying attention to label directions on timing of those applications. We can still use herbicides during drought conditions. When we are in drought conditions, we just need to try to avoid the high heat of the day. Keep in mind our plants, weeds, and or our grass, when they are drought stressed, they are not going to actively take in as much herbicide. So we want to try to optimize when they are most likely trying to take in moisture, which would be in the morning when we have cooler temperatures and hopefully possibly some dew. Though most likely those stomates, the openings on the leaves that take in moisture, that also take in herbicide, are more likely to be open at that morning time period. And that's also when we'll have some lower temperatures. So that will also help with absorption and movement of that herbicide through those weeds, through that undesired vegetation. We also want to make sure that we're using, high quality adjuvants such as surfactants. It may require greater investment, but using a high quality surfactant can improve the herbicide effectiveness for many of our products. By referring to those labels for the correct product combinations or the correct adjuvants is truly the only way to proceed. Weed identification is always critical in regards to determining the best timing of a herbicide application and the best recommendation for control. You have Corey, myself, we can help you with identification via email, pictures emailed or texted. We can do our best to help you identify plants you're not familiar with and then provide you with some options or recommendations when it comes to herbicide applications or otherwise. So insect pest, we can hope that with our warm, dry conditions, and currently I have not had any fall armyworm reports. I've not seen any myself. They do we see greater numbers of fall armyworms when we have cooler temperatures as well as moisture. So that will be something to keep in mind as we move through the season. If we are in drought conditions and then we get some moisture in the fall, we should definitely start scouting for those armyworms. Cooler temperatures and moisture just increase their reproductive capacity. They can produce more eggs, they'll lay more eggs, they'll hatch faster, and those larvae will have greater larva survival when we have those conditions. Now, what we are likely to see in hot, dry conditions are a lot of grasshoppers. I've been in several fields already in East Texas where there are grasshoppers galore because we do have hot, dry conditions. Grasshoppers consume a lot of forage. They consume half of their body weight every day, so they can reduce our forage production as well. A lot of the products that we use for armyworm control will also actively control grasshoppers. As always, we want to try to make those insecticide applications when those larvae are small or when those grasshoppers are small. Once these grasshoppers develop wings, they're much harder to control because they move greater distances. They're also larger, so it would take a higher rate of an insecticide to potentially be effective. So scouting your fields and making applications early is really the only way to be effective with insect pest control. On the lower right-hand side is the Bermuda grass stem maggot. That's the actual maggot. I have not had any reports as of yet, but I anticipate as we get closer to the end of June, the beginning of July, I will start seeing the damage caused by the Bermuda grass stem maggot, as well as I'll probably start getting phone calls. So the damage is the loss of the top 2 to 3 leaves of your Bermuda grass. For us in hay production, we're going to see damage much more often than we will in a pasture, especially this year with drier conditions. We may not see as much damage in a pasture scenario because our livestock are consuming that top portion of the plant. But if you're in hay production, in the next couple of weeks, I would start scouting your fields for damage, for the discoloration of those top 2 to 3 leaves. Once it has had damage, you can pull those leaves out of that plant. If you have damage, if you are close to harvesting, I would recommend harvesting as soon as possible. That will reduce the impact to your yield or loss of yield that you would have as a result of the Bermuda grass stem maggot. And then upon harvesting and removal of that hay, I would come in and make an application with the pyrethroid insecticide. So that could be Mustang Max, Lambda Psi, Grizzly, Tombstone, any pyrethroid. So those insecticides with the active ingredients that end with THRIN. So lambda cyhalothrin, cyfluthrin, that end with that THRIN. Those are pyrethroids, and they will have activity on the adult fly. So harvest, make a pyrethroid application, and then in another 7 to 10 days, make a second application. And that is trying to impact the fly population. So their life cycle is very short. It's 3 weeks to go from larva all the way, or from larva all the way back to adult fly. So they have a short life cycle. So those 2 applications would hopefully have an impact on that fly population and hopefully reduce future damage. But so far, if you have Bermuda grass in the state of Texas, you have the Bermuda grass stem maggot, whether it's in your yard or pasture or hay meadow. So I would recommend in the next couple of weeks, start looking in your hay meadows for potential damage, because if we are fertilizing our hay meadows, we want to optimize that nutrient utilization and get the best yield. We don't want something like Bermuda grass stem maggot to knock our yield back, and it can reduce your yield very quickly. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind moving forward in the next couple of weeks. Start looking for any potential damage. So just in review, and we'll have some time for questions, which will be good. As far as, following best management practices, whenever it comes to hay production, soil fertility, hopefully all of you have already collected soil samples, have already, evaluated that as we move through our hay production season. Keep in mind, weather is going to reduce our forage production. And if you are not fertilizing, you will also see a drop in yield as well. So just be mindful. If you have any questions about reading a soil analysis or how to effectively still fertilize your pastures or hay meadows, where myself and Corey were happy to help to sit down with you and talk about some options. If you come across some alternative sources or supposed sources of nutrients, please ask more questions before you invest a lot of dollars into a product that you're not very familiar with. Seek more information from some unbiased sources such as myself and Corey. We can do some digging, ask the right questions, get you the information that helps you make the best decision. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I do have a website, Forage Facts. So this presentation is not on my website. I'm happy to share it with Corey. He can then share it with everyone that's interested. You can find my contact information as well as other excellent information on forage production, information on weed control, Bermuda grass stem maggot control, what have you. So it's a good resource in my opinion, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions? We'll allow a little time for questions.
I'd like to ask a question, please. My name is Pam Hodge.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the information about fertilizers especially. And I did make a decision this year because of the price of fertilizers to focus on nitrogen and let my K number slip. Is it too late in the season to try to address that?
No, it is never too late. The good thing with nutrients like phosphorus and potassium, they're not mobile. You're not going to lose them to the environment. It's always best to apply potassium at, anytime. So if you do need some potassium, the sooner the better, of course, but it's not too late. One thing I failed to mention with potassium is that Bermuda grass can be a luxury consumer. So depending on what your recommendation was on your soil analysis, if they recommend more than 75 pounds to the acre, you would need to split that application. So say if they recommended 100 pounds of potassium per acre, I would split that into 2 applications. So whether that's 50 pounds now and then 50 pounds in 4 to 6 weeks, or between hay cuttings, that would be my recommendation, so that you have potassium available all season and it's not lost to use. Bermuda grass is kind of like a kid in a candy store. If you gave them all 100 pounds at a single application, in a couple of weeks, you could have a deficiency, even though you applied what was recommended. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Diesel fuel also means it makes it a lot more expensive. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, Dr. Olson.
Howdy.
This is Erdogan Memeli. I serve as the Executive Associate Director of Research here in our college at Prairie View.
Okay. Nice to meet you.
Likewise, and I appreciate your presentation and, of course, the seminar series that Ashley and Corey and others are leading here is very inspiring. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
So with the current sort of challenges of especially heat stress, what are the kind of a high priority needed areas of applied research that the stakeholders need as far as connecting the whole system science? You mentioned the soil chemistry, the plants, and then the animals, and ultimately animal foods that influence human health. Any areas that the stakeholders are really much in need? I saw your map of red, sort of a maroon color drought in this area. So what are your recommendations for stakeholder needs as far as applied research?
Well, luckily, a lot of forage research has been done in Overton since the conception of the center here in East Texas. Dr. Monty Roquette, Dr. Gerald Evers, Lloyd Nelson have done a lot of research and a lot of applied research over the years. And a lot of it, even though it's old, is still very valuable and is excellent. And research, like I mentioned, that Dr. Beatty and Dr. Paul Baumann did, looking at how fertilization or lack of and weed control, how those influence forage production. So that's an excellent question. It might require some more thought. I do think something that we have been missing in the last several years has been some variety evaluations. Variety trials are very difficult to do because they're expensive. I mean, as with all research, money is always the linchpin as to whether it gets done or not. But that's something that I get a lot of questions is about variety selection and yield comparison, because it is very confusing to consumers. When they go to buy Bermuda grass, they might go to the seed store and there's 10 different options and everybody has a different opinion. And they do want that, research data comparison. The last variety trial data that was done in Texas on Bermuda grass was in 1990-91 by Dr. Gerald Evers. We haven't done any since then. And that variety trial information is important for our producers. And Dr. Ray Smith here at Overton continues some ryegrass variety trials, but because Dr. Nelson retired, nobody's doing any small grain forage variety trials in East Texas. And so, I think a lot of that information is important to help producers make the best selection of varieties of different forage species, or just comparison of different forage species, and having some of that kind of basic information. I think that's important.
Well, thank you very much. We are planning to develop a position on animal nutrition, primarily nutrition of ruminants.
Okay.
So I would love to visit with you and with Dr. Hopefully Pellerin soon and others from our extension side to come up with a way to develop that position to address critical questions for stakeholders.
Yes. Someone else you might want to include on that conversation is Dr. Jason Banta. He's here at Overton. He's our ruminant nutritionist with Animal Science. He's stationed here in Overton. He's been here for almost 17 years. And in my opinion, he's probably the best ruminant nutritionist in the state of Texas. He would be a great resource in that discussion as well.
Sounds great. Thank you. Will do. Of course, I visited with and listened to Dr. George Perry a couple of times.
Okay.
I'm an animal
Yes.
scientist with emphasis on reproduction. So
Right.
great. Thanks so much. And thanks, Corey, and your team for this great seminar series.
Yes, sir. Thank you for attending. We have one more question here in the chat box. But before we go to that, I want to go ahead and spring our poll up. If you all who's attending, please fill out our poll. Therefore, we kind of know that we're on target with the information that you're wanting. It should be up, but continue asking questions while we have time. The question that was in the chat box is from Ms. Hodge, and she said, Dr. Olson, do you have any recommendations on winter cover crops that can help address soil nutrient deficiencies?
Okay. That's a great question, Pam. So we have a lot of options in East Texas as far as cool season forages that we can overseed into our warm season perennial stands. So the top recommendations are either standalone or in combination. Annual ryegrass is an excellent cool season forage that we can utilize for grazing. Our small grain rye would be my top recommendation of the small grains, and then legumes. So our cool season annual legumes such as arrowleaf clover, crimson clover, white or ball clover. Now, a lot of people are very interested in legumes right now because legumes do not need nitrogen, because they can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere that's free. Through a symbiotic or a positive relationship, they can fix that free nitrogen. And then through a grazing system, we can recycle that back into our soil, because our animals or livestock ruminants only keep 10 to 30% of the nutrients they ingest. So the other 70 to 90% that they're consuming is going back into that pasture through their feces and urine. Now, the challenge with legumes for us in East Texas is soil pH. Our legumes are going to prefer a soil pH of at least a 6. So you will need to look at the cost of liming. If you've had a soil test recently, you could use that as your guide. Well, based on what, that tells you what your soil pH is now. You may likely need to go ahead and start liming to try to get your soil pH to a 6 prior to planting those legumes. Now, those legumes are also going to need phosphorus and potassium. So you mentioned you had neglected your potassium level to try to save some dollars. You would definitely need to add potassium and any phosphorus, but you may be okay on phosphorus, but you would definitely need to add that potassium for that legume, and then look back at your soil pH and what lime might need to be added. Now, the other thing I want to forewarn you guys in regards to winter forages, if we go back to that map, the United States, all of our legume seed and ryegrass comes out of Oregon. Oregon is in a drought right now, and they've been in drought conditions. So I'm a bit concerned about seed supply and therefore seed cost. I don't have any legume seed cost as of yet. I typically do not get that information from retailers until maybe not even until August. So come the beginning of August, I would start calling your local retailers to see if they have an idea of what seed might cost. I'm afraid it's never cheap, but I'm afraid it's going to be more expensive. And then freight obviously will influence the cost of that seed because it has to come from Oregon to us. So that could be an additional added expense or higher expense for us this year. So the reason a lot of people are confused why we buy seed from a state that has no environmental conditions similar to ours, it's because they have a longer seed production season, so they can get greater seed production off of those legumes and ryegrass in Oregon than we ever could in Texas or any other areas of the South. So they'll still grow in Texas. That's just why they come from Oregon. So she wanted me to repeat the list of legumes. So arrowleaf clover, I'll type them in the chat too, but arrowleaf clover, crimson clover, white clover, or ball clover. Now, I do have a publication on Forage Facts website. I'll put that back up. There is a publication on establishing cool season legumes. Let's see, I may have to share my screen again since I messed with my display. Sorry about that. There is a publication on Forage Facts about planting or overseeding legumes or ryegrass into a warm season perennial sod. And the other thing, Pam, if you have a well-drained location, I would recommend either arrowleaf clover or crimson clover. Now, if you have a poorly drained location like a creek bottom and a tighter soil that holds more moisture, you could plant ball or white clover. So it really will depend on your location as to which clover species will do best.
While we're talking about clovers and legumes, is there one in particular that's least likely to cause bloat if you're running ruminants on there?
Okay, so that's a good question. Ball clover tends to have the highest potential for bloating, but I will tell you that we can have animals bloat on any of those clovers. My recommendation is to, one, never turn hungry animals onto a new stand of any forage. So even if you're introducing them to Bermuda grass for the first time, they've been on Bahia grass, make sure they are quote unquote fed or full before you introduce them to a new forage. So you can provide a dry hay along with access to that pasture. When they're grazing, there are bloat guards that can be provided to reduce bloat risk on legumes. A lot of producers in East Texas very commonly plant a combination of ryegrass and a legume. So annual ryegrass and one of these legume species, they do very well in growing in the same location together. And that grass, having that grass can help reduce some of that bloat potential as well. All right, so Pam asked, is there a planting ratio so as to not compete with the Bermuda grass in the spring? Unfortunately, the only way to not compete with the Bermuda grass in the spring is to not plant anything at all into that stand. So there are different seeding recommendations based on what you overseed into that stand. I do recommend utilizing winter forages, ryegrass, legumes all the time. You just have to manage them in the spring and know that you're going to take a reduction in Bermuda grass production the next season. So our ryegrass and our legumes, even though we call them winter forage, they're actually much more of a spring forage producer. So majority of their forage production is in the spring. So you will likely or could likely increase your stocking rate from March on into April, May, and possibly June, depending on our weather, to get that forage grazed down or utilized. This is why I do not recommend overseeding a hay meadow unless you are going to graze it heavily, get it grazed down. Even if Dr. Evers did some research, even if you did a light disking of Bermuda grass during the winter, and didn't plant anything, you reduce your Bermuda grass production the next season. So anything that we do during the fall and winter on that Bermuda grass stand will influence production the next year. Now, that's not to mean that you shouldn't utilize winter forages. You just have to understand that it's going to impact your Bermuda grass yield. So I do not recommend overseeding a hay meadow, because for most of us, our hay meadow is kind of our prized possession or our favorite child. And so if we anticipate or we want a high level of production out of that hay meadow, do not overseed that hay meadow with anything for a winter. So in a pasture system, it's more tolerable.
All righty. Well, thank you, Vanessa, for that good conversation and good information as well. If y'all have any more questions, etc., y'all don't hesitate to give me a call or give Vanessa a call directly over at the Research Center. At this time, we'll go ahead and end the program. Thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you're able to take something today and apply it to your operation for success. Don't hesitate to give us a call. Thank y'all. Have a good rest of your day.